again, everyone. We're excited to have you join us for our Cash for College FAFSA Updates webinar. As you saw, there was some breaking news earlier this week about the FAFSA in its beta version being open to all students. So we'll definitely address that during the webinar today. But ultimately, with our webinar, we want to show you each step of completing the FAFSA and make sure you feel confident guiding students and their families through this process. So without further ado, we would like to thank our sponsors who are instrumental in supporting this work. They make sure all of these trainings are completely free to our educators and our community-based leaders. So we want to thank them for that. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our primary partners in this work, so the Alabama Commission on Higher Education, Alabama Community College System, Alabama State Department of Education, and then Get Educated, which is the Common Black College application where students can apply to over 60 HBCUs for free. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If everyone could please keep their microphones on mute at all times to avoid any feedback during the presentation. We always record our professional development trainings, so these will be uploaded to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/alabamapossible. If at any point you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to drop those into the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that as we go. We do have a few kind of scheduled pauses throughout the presentation because it is a lot of content today. So we'll make sure that we address your questions during those as well. Like I mentioned, at the end of our webinar, we'll have some time for poll questions. If you're looking for professional development credit, then we need you to stay all the way towards the end to answer those poll questions. We would love to see all of the work y'all are doing, especially around financial aid and the FAFSA. So if you would share all of the wonderful things you're doing with your students, you can always tag our accounts at AL Goes to College. That's the number 2. And especially as it relates to financial aid, we recommend using hashtags like hashtag PellYes, hashtag FAFSA, and hashtag Cash for College. So I'm sure many of y'all are familiar, but the Alabama Goes to College campaign consists of 3 different components. And today we're really going to be focusing on this first one, Cash for College. So our goal is for every graduating senior to complete their free application for federal student aid before they graduate. And of course, that is one of the tasks on their graduation checklist. But ultimately, we want them to do this because it not just determines their eligibility for federal aid, but it also opens up the doors to institutional aid and state aid as well. So today, the bulk of what we're going to be doing is talking about the steps to prepare for and complete the FAFSA. And we're going to be going through essentially each screen of the FAFSA as if we are a student, and specifically as if we are a dependent student, knowing that most of our high school seniors are dependent students. And then we're going to highlight some of the key updates for the 2025-26 FAFSA. So our first poll, I'm going to launch that now. We want to know what percentage of your students already have created their FSA ID. So you should see a poll on your screen. And I know y'all have all different class sizes. So some of you are supporting hundreds of seniors. We understand that that load is a huge lift. It's reasonable that we'll see all different percentage responses here. And we're bringing this question to you today because if you saw in our newsletter this week, we got data from federal student aid that only 17.9% of Alabama seniors had created their FSA ID. And we know this is one of the tasks that you can always get done in advance of the FAFSA opening up. And so we typically recommend that students work on this in September or October. So almost everyone's responded to this question. And the greatest response was 0 to 19%. So that's definitely aligning with the data that we got from federal student aid. We did have about 21% responding 80 to 100%, so I'm excited to see that. And I hope that, I know it's an extremely busy time of year, but I hope y'all will have a little bit of time in your schedule to ensure that students are getting this done over the next couple of weeks. But we'll definitely talk about the FSA ID creation process today. So I'm sure most of you know the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and we really want to reiterate to students that it's opening access to all kinds of aid like grants, scholarships, work study jobs, and low interest loans. And I think sometimes people are only thinking of the loan aspect because they're thinking about student debt when they're thinking about federal student aid. But we really want to highlight grants, especially the Pell Grant, because more than half of Alabama seniors are eligible for Pell Grant aid. So it's especially important for our students. And so right now, the 2025-26 FAFSA, which is the form that our seniors are completing, it's still in its beta version, which essentially just means that federal student aid is continuing to enhance it. But this beta version has now opened up to all students. So prior to this week, it was only available to select organizations who were picked to participate in beta testing, but now it's opened up to everyone, which is both exciting, and we want to continuing seeing those enhancements that federal student aid has promised. So real quick, we have essentially 7 steps that we consider to be the main steps related to this financial aid process. In our earlier webinar back in October, we really focused on steps 1 and 2. So creating the FSA ID and then gathering documents. We're going to quickly recap that today, but the bulk of our focus is going to be on steps 3 and 4 today. And then we'll kind of quickly go through 5 through 7 towards the end, but we're going to focus on filling out the actual application today. So like I mentioned, in October, we had our FAFSA 101 webinar that covered in great detail the process of creating the FSA ID and then gathering documents to be able to do the FAFSA. So I am going to go through this part rather quickly. Hopefully it's just review for most of y'all. But an FSA ID is just a username and password for the account that the student will use on federal student aid. So they're going to use this not only for the FAFSA, but for managing any loans they have. It's everything federal student aid related. And it is required to have this account prior to starting the FAFSA form. So students are able to create it in advance by going to studentaid.gov. And so we always recommend September, October as the time frame for doing this. And especially because for some students, it will take a while to process. So generally you can expect 1 to 3 days for the Social Security Administration to authenticate the student's account. A verified email address is required, so we always like to remind students to not use an email address that they're going to lose access to, such as a temporary work or school email. And then we also encourage them to not use any kind of shared email address like a family email. It needs to be their own personal account. So we have this worksheet that's available in our educator's toolkit. So it just gives step-by-step everything you need to be able to create the account. Then we give tips along the way. The process asks for a student's phone number. A student doesn't actually have to provide a phone number. It is recommended if a student has their own personal cell number that they do list that when creating their account, because that just serves as one more way to authenticate and verify who they are so that if they ever get locked out of their account, they can get a ping to their cell number to let them back into the account. So an email is required and a phone number is preferred if a student does have their own cell number. But again, we don't want them to use anyone else's cell number. So who other than the student needs an FSA ID? So some students will need to invite people to contribute information to their FAFSA, and these contributors also need an FSA ID. And ultimately, who contributes to a student's FAFSA will depend on the student's dependency status. And dependency status is determined by a student's responses to a set of questions. So when the student's completing their actual FAFSA form, they're going to be presented with these questions and they'll just answer and click through each screen. But also, you have this link that will be in the slides we send out later today that will show you all of the questions at once so that you can know in advance whether or not your student is dependent or independent. The vast majority of our high school seniors are dependent students, which means that they will have to provide parent information. And so I use this word contributors and just want to define it real quick. So contributors are any individual required to provide consent and approval for federal tax information, along with their signature on the FAFSA form. So this includes the student's spouse if they're married, a biological or adoptive parent, or the parent's spouse, which would be the student's step parent. And so without consent, the FAFSA is considered incomplete, and then the student is ineligible for aid. So basically, anyone contributing to a FAFSA is agreeing for the form to be able to look for tax information. If there isn't any tax information, not really a problem. But it's just giving permission for the system to look for that tax information and then directly pull it in if there is any. So, in terms of who needs to contribute, we have independent students who are not going to need to provide parent information. They're only going to need to provide information for themselves and then their spouse if they're married. And if they're married and they did not file taxes with their spouse, then their spouse is going to need an FSA ID. Most of our students are dependent students, though, so they're going to need to provide information about themselves and their parent. And then it will depend on a few factors which parent needs to create an FSA ID. So we have two different tools we can use to determine which parent needs to contribute. We have the Parent Wizard tool, and then we have the Is My Parent a Contributor flow chart that we've been using for several years that will tell you which family member needs an FSA ID. So I believe we have, this is a screenshot of the Parent Wizard tool. It's new this year. And so the student enters the first name of their parent or parents, and then they answer a series of questions, and the tool tells them who needs to create an account, who needs to contribute. And then this is the flow chart that we've been using for several years. It's another way for students to figure out who needs to contribute. So they just go through the series of questions and it tells them who will need to contribute. So this is also accessible in our toolkit. So we're going to go through some scenarios. So if you're at our FAFSA 101 webinar, you've already heard these, but it doesn't hurt to just go through it again. So our first scenario is Walker. And Walker has been living with his grandmother, Betty, ever since his parents, Kim and Jordan, got divorced. Betty has not legally adopted Walker and is not his legal guardian as determined by a court. Betty, the grandmother, provides most of Walker's financial support, and then Jordan contributes the rest. So I'm going to let y'all read that really quickly again, and then I'm going to pull up the Parent Wizard tool and we're going to go through this together. So we're asked to put the first names of the parents. So we have Kim and Jordan, who are the parents, and they we know that they are divorced. So are they married to each other? No. Do they live together? No. And then which parent has provided more financial support for the student over the past 12 months? So the scenario told us that the grandmother is providing a lot of the financial support.
And then Jordan is providing the rest. So, in terms of which parent has provided more financial support for the student over the past 12 months, Jordan has. So, we're going to click Jordan, and then we don't have any information that says Jordan has remarried. So, we're going to answer this question no. And then the wizard tells us that only Jordan is a parent on the student's FAFSA form. So, the student will need to invite Jordan to the form. And then Jordan will create an FSA ID if they don't already have one in order to be able to contribute to the student's FAFSA.
So just to reiterate, the grandmother's financial contribution actually doesn't matter in this situation because the grandmother is not considered a legal parent. The grandmother hasn't legally adopted Walker, and then the grandmother's not a legal guardian as determined by a court. So we're only considering Kim and Jordan in this situation. And then it does say Jordan contributes the rest. So we're going to have Jordan as the primary parent. Okay, scenario 2. Josh's father passed away when he was 5. His mother, Julie, got remarried to Terrence when Josh was 8. Julie and Terrence file taxes together, and Terrence has not legally adopted Josh. So Terrence is Josh's stepfather. And then we have Julie, the mother. Who is considered a legal parent? When we click this, it gives us a definition that legal parents are biological or adoptive. So in this situation, the student has one parent who passed away and then one living parent, and that living parent got remarried. So the student has a step parent, but the step parent did not adopt the student. So in this situation, the student only has one legal parent. So that's going to be the living mother. And then Julie is married. So the wizard instructs us that Julie is the parent on the FAFSA form. So Julie is going to be invited by the student to contribute. And then Julie, if Julie doesn't already have an FSA ID, Julie will need to create one and then contribute to the student's form. And then Julie's spouse, Terrence, the step parent, that spouse's information will be included on the form, but whether or not the spouse needs an FSA ID will depend on if Julie and Terrence file their taxes together. So if they file their taxes jointly, then only Julie's going to need to create an FSA ID and add information as a contributor. And then she'll be able to just add information about her new spouse without the spouse having to create their own FSA ID. Now, if they don't file taxes jointly, then both Julie and her new spouse, Terrence, will have to have their own FSA IDs and both contribute to the student's FAFSA. So it tells you for each of those situations in pretty great detail. So we highly encourage you to use the parent wizard as you're navigating these situations, especially because we know not every student has just a straightforward situation. We know a lot of students don't live with their parents, might live with an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. So it's just important to think through this very carefully. So they do file taxes together, so Terrence won't need to create an FSA ID. So like I mentioned, the parent wizard will tell you who the student needs to invite, and the student is almost always only going to invite one parent. If a second parent needs to be invited, that usually can be done by the first parent. So the student typically will not be inviting two parents. But for students who can invite either parent to contribute, so this applies to students with parents who are married and file taxes together, the student should choose the parent who already has an FSA ID if that's applicable. So because a student with married parents who file their taxes together only needs one to contribute, if one already has an FSA ID, just invite that parent.
In the following section, we discuss what the FAFSA looks like for mixed status families, meaning families comprised of students who are eligible for federal aid and parents who do not have social security numbers. We just wanted to say that we understand that mixed status families might be hesitant to share their information with the federal government given the current political climate. While information shared on the FAFSA has historically been used for no other reason than to determine aid eligibility, we understand families might be concerned about providing their information amidst the incoming administration's anti immigrant rhetoric. So, we, Alabama Possible, are continuing to monitor the situation with our national partners and are awaiting further guidance from federal policy analysts and lawyers. Students with undocumented parents might consider waiting to complete their FAFSA until we have more details.
Okay, so if the student has parents who don't have social security numbers, so if their parents are undocumented, their parents are still going to need FSA IDs. And when they're creating those FSA IDs, they're just going to check a box indicating they don't have a social security number. And if by chance they do have an ITIN or an individual taxpayer identification number, they're not going to use that ITIN in place of a social security number. So let me show you what this looks like. So when they're creating the account, they're adding their name, birthday, and then where it says social security number, they'll check the box that they don't have one. And they're not going to put an ITIN in this spot. And then because they're not going to be able to authenticate their identity through the Social Security Administration, they have an alternate path for verifying. But as many of you know, there were a lot of issues with verifying identities of non-Social Security number holders last year. So because of that, federal student aid has essentially waived the requirement for identity verification for this population. If a parent is able to verify their identity, we encourage it because it will make the process a bit easier in future years, but they're not required to for this cycle. And we also understand politically there might be some hesitation with putting in a kind of identifying information with their name, especially for our undocumented parents. So these folks, they are required to have FSA IDs, and because the identity verification process is waived, they're still able to immediately access the FAFSA even if they don't verify their identity. But this group will have to manually input their financial information. So they're not going to be able to use the direct data exchange that pulls tax information into the FAFSA. They're going to be manually inputting their financial info. And in this situation, so in most cases, we recommend a student invite their parent to contribute to the FAFSA. But in this particular situation, we encourage the parent to start the FAFSA and invite the student. And that's to avoid certain matching complications that currently exist in the FAFSA form. And I'll kind of give you an example of that with a screenshot that will hopefully make it make more sense. And then just to go over this, even though this isn't required, parents without social security numbers will verify their identity through an alternate path. And what that path is, essentially, as they're going through the FSA ID creation process, they're going to answer knowledge-based verification questions if those are actually presented to them. So if they answer those questions correctly, great, their identity is verified. If they answer the question incorrectly, or if they simply don't see these questions at all, which is an option, then they're going to have to do two other steps, which is completing an attestation form and then submitting required identity documentation. So just know for this part right here, this process has once again been waived this year. So this isn't required, but if a parent can verify their identity and wants to verify their identity, they can do it manually this way. So we've been told that the attestation form this year should be available to fill out and submit online. So they wouldn't have to print off a paper and email it back in completed. It should just be a form to submit online. And then they have to accompany that with a few different identity documents. So this is an example of the form that you might have seen last year, and it should be able to fill out online. And then these are the acceptable identification documents that they can submit with their attestation form. So that was creating the FSA ID. Our next step is to gather any documents in advance of starting the actual FAFSA. And we recommend doing that in advance because it can save time and then it also ensures accuracy if they have everything gathered. So we have a checklist available for you. I have a screenshot here. It goes over all the things that a student would need to gather. And then if the student is a dependent student, all of the things that a parent would need to gather. And just so y'all know, this checklist, it's in our educator's toolkit. A lot of the underlined text, those are links that you can click for more information. So if you want even more detail, those are all taking you to resources that go in depth with all of this. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause now for questions. Um, so I had a question about the attestation form that a parent without a social security number would be completing. So we've been told that it will be available online. I have yet to receive a link for that. So at the moment, I don't have anything to give you for them to be able to do that. But as soon as we hear anything, we'll definitely make an announcement in our newsletter, ensure that you have the link. But we were told by federal student aid that it should be fillable online. All right, we're going to go straight to it because this really is the bulk of our presentation, but we want to talk about filling out the actual application. So your high school seniors are going to be completing the 2025-26 FAFSA because that's how they apply for aid for fall semester 2025 through summer semester 2026. And then they might have already seen while they were creating their FSA IDs that the 2024-25 FAFSA was available. Sometimes we get students who are really eager to start and they go ahead and start filling that out. That is actually for the current academic year. So sometimes that's confusing for students and a correction that y'all will need to make in your messaging to them. But we do point out the two different FAFSAs because the one situation where a high school senior would need to complete this 2024-25 FAFSA is if they're going to start school right after graduation. So say they're starting school June 2025. Depending on which college they're attending, the college might require them to fill out this FAFSA for financial aid for that summer semester. So as it relates to the summers, it's always good to check with the actual college which FAFSA they want the student to complete for that. So that's just reiterating what I said. It's always good to check with the college for summer semesters. And then if you have students who have already started the 2024-25 FAFSA, but they don't actually need to, they can delete that and then they can get started on the appropriate one, which is 2025-26. So we're going to go step by step through the application as if we're a student. Starting off with the landing page. So you should see now that this is available so they can start a new form. So we're going to assume the student is starting a brand new one. Remember, in some situations, we do advise the parent to start the form. That will be for our citizen students who have parents without social security numbers. In that case, we advise the parent to start. But for most situations, we advise the student to start. So when the student clicks start, if they're not already logged in to their federal student aid account, they'll be prompted to log in. We've gotten a lot of feedback that the student is unable to log in when they use their username. I have found it's always best to just use their email address here. I've seen a lot of trouble when the student attempts to use a username. So recommending a email address right there. After they log in, they select their role. So they select student. And then they're essentially presented with all these onboarding videos. So they're given 4 different onboarding videos to learn more about the financial aid process. Once they've watched those, if they'd like, then they're getting to their identity information. So this is going to be the information that they input while they created their federal student aid account. If they need to make any corrections to this, they're not going to be able to on this screen. They're actually going to have to go up to their account settings, which should be up in the top right. But we do encourage them, if they see anything that looks like it needs to be corrected, to go ahead and do that, like a mailing address or something like that. Then they're going to select the state from the drop down and say the month and year that they became a legal resident. Um, so most of our students are, they're going to be putting Alabama, and then if they were born in Alabama, they're going to be putting their birth month and year, or if they moved to Alabama, they're going to put when they moved to Alabama. So then the next part is going to be showing the direct data exchange. And this is where it's going to transfer any federal tax information from the IRS to the Department of Education. And a student is going to need to provide their consent and approval for the system to check if there are any tax records. So they're always going to need to provide consent and approval, and the system will continuously remind them that this is a requirement for them to be eligible for aid. A student's contributors also have to provide consent and approval. And then any information that is transferred over from the IRS, that will not be seen anywhere on the front end of the form. It will just be transferred into the back end. With this year's FAFSA, so for the 2025-26 FAFSA, we're using 2023 tax returns. So those are the returns that just got filed from January 2024 until ideally the filing deadline in April 2024. So the most recent taxes that got filed. And we recommend that families, even though they will hopefully be able to use the direct data exchange, that they still have access to an electronic or a PDF of their tax returns and any supporting documents, just as something to reference for certain additional questions that they might encounter throughout the FAFSA. So this is what consent and approval looks like. So it's telling you you have to provide it or you won't be eligible for federal student aid. So it's going to continuously remind students that that's the case, and then it's going to give them a lot of information about what all of this means. So if the student did have their own tax records and the system finds those, then it will securely import those into the student's FAFSA. If the student doesn't have any tax records to be pulled, then it's just going to give a notification, data not received. So unable to find anything, and that's totally fine. So if the student doesn't file any taxes, then this will be the message that they see. Then we're going to move on to the personal circumstances section. And this is what determines if a student is a dependent student, meaning they need to provide parent info, or an independent student, meaning they do not need to provide parent info. So we're in a kind of this, essentially this first section, the personal circumstances section, and they're just going to answer questions about themselves. So their marital status, and then their college or career plans. So for our high school seniors, they should be selecting that during the 2025-26 school year, they're going to be first year students. And they're going to answer this way, even if they've been in dual enrollment as a high school student. This is going to be their first year. Essentially, what the FAFSA is trying to get at is, have you received federal student aid before? And have you used up any of your aid eligibility yet? And for our dual enrollment students, they haven't done that. So they're going to put first year. And then when the student begins that academic year, will they already have their first bachelor's degree? For our high school seniors, the answer is no. Then we're going to ask if any of the listed personal circumstances apply to the student. So these are essentially our dependency questions. If the student answers yes to any of these, they are an independent student who does not have to provide parent information. But if they select that none of these apply, then they are a dependent student who does have to provide parent information. So the scenario we're going through right now is for a student who is a dependent student. So in this case, none of these apply. It's going to ask if the student was homeless or at risk of being homeless. For this student, we're going to answer no. But if the student were to answer yes, the form will ask them if a specific program determined the student to be homeless. So that would include a director or designee of an emergency or transitional shelter, a street outreach program, a homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving those experiencing homelessness. It could also be the student's high school or district homeless liaison, or a director or designee of a project supported by a federal TRIO or Gear Up program, or even a financial aid administrator. So if the student's saying yes, they're homeless, it's asking, has someone basically confirmed your homeless status? But in this situation we're going to answer no, the student's not homeless. So in our situation where the student is a dependent student, they're going to have to provide parent information. But the only time that a dependent student does not have to provide parent information is if the student has what's called unusual circumstances. And these unusual circumstances are going to allow a dependent student to essentially receive what's called a provisional student aid index without providing parent information. So the student's going to say, hey, I have this unusual circumstance. And then they're going to need to provide documentation to their college to essentially prove that they can't get parent information. And then once they've proven that, they'll get their final student aid index. But until they provide the documentation, it will just be provisional. So I want to give you some examples of what unusual circumstances are. So it's going to ask the student, do any of these prevent you from contacting your parents, or would contacting your parents pose a risk to you? So examples would be if the student left home due to an abusive or threatening environment, if they're abandoned by or estranged from their parents, if they have refugee or asylee status and are separated from their parents, or if their parents are displaced, if they're a victim of human trafficking, if the student's incarcerated, or if their parents are incarcerated and contact would pose a risk, or if they're otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents. We kind of caution you against this last bullet to not interpret it liberally. It really does need to be one of these circumstances that a student can document with their college. So if the student is answering yes, that they have one of these circumstances, they can be considered provisionally independent. For our purposes, we're just going to consider the student to not have these circumstances and answer the question no. So in this scenario, the student's determined to be dependent, which means they have to provide parent information. So the FAFSA is telling the student you are a dependent student. And then it's going to ask if the student's parents refuse to provide information. So we've heard feedback from many of you that some parents just flat out refuse to participate in this process. This would be the point at which a student can indicate their parent refuses, although we really try to exhaust every single resource possible to get the parent to contribute. But if it ultimately comes down to a situation where a parent is unwilling, the student can answer that their parents are refusing, which means they're only eligible for a direct, unsubsidized loan. So, as much as possible, we don't want a student to answer yes to this. We do everything in our power to get the parents to contribute to the student's form. So then it's going to start asking the student questions about their parents. So it's going to ask if the parents are married to each other. And when it's asking about the parent, it is very specifically asking about a legal parent, which is defined as a biological or adoptive parent only. And that's the same way that it's phrased in the Parent Wizard tool. So we're not talking about aunts or uncles or a guardian that the student lives with. It has to be a biological or adoptive parent. And when the student responds to the questions asked about the parents, it's going to tell the student whose information needs to be provided. When students are inviting their parents to contribute, they're going to get the parent, they're going to submit the name, the date of birth, the social security number, and then the email address of their contributor. The email, all of the information needs to be completely accurate, but the email address doesn't necessarily have to be the email address that the contributor used when they created their FSA ID. That doesn't have to be a match. It can really just be whatever email address that parent uses most and accesses most. And then if the student enters any information incorrectly, they'll need to correct it in order for the invitation to be successful. Now, if the parent doesn't have a social security number, then the student's going to indicate that, and instead they're going to provide a mailing address. And that mailing address must exactly match whatever the parent input when they were creating their FSA ID. So abbreviations, capitalization, punctuation, it has to exactly match. Now, we did get word that Federal Student Aid is going to be working on the invitation portion of the application to try to make it so that if a parent enters street spelled out and a student enters street abbreviated, that it will find that as a match. But as of right now, it needs to be an exact match. So if a student is inviting their parent, they'll want to check exactly how a parent put this. But we want to avoid all of this. So this is why we really encourage parents to start the FAFSA if the parent doesn't have a social security number, because we know this matching process caused headaches for so many people in the past. So ultimately, if parents don't have social security numbers, it might be a good idea to have them start the FAFSA. Okay. This part is one I want to hopefully explain as clearly as possible. So this is the parent invitation page, and we want the student to invite the appropriate parent to contribute. And we typically recommend that they only invite one parent. So when a student gets to this page, they're likely going to see two fields as if they need to invite two parents. But in most cases, they only need to invite one. So, what I strongly recommend is that when students get to this page, they go to the parent wizard and fill it out as we just did in our scenarios and see what the wizard tells them to do. Because, admittedly, the language on this invitation page can be very misleading. So, it might say, let's see what this one says. It says, based on, I know y'all might have trouble seeing this, based on your answers in the previous section, you'll need to provide information about both of your parents. And it says this doesn't make them financially responsible. But then it says you can invite one or both parents. So it's telling you you can do either. We really never recommend inviting both because it just can cause problems for the student for technical glitch reasons. So even though this page is telling them they can invite both, we strongly recommend only inviting one, in particular, the parent that the parent wizard tools told us to invite. So students with two parents should not invite both just because they see the two columns. Again, we recommend using that parent wizard tool. And just to kind of explain that a little further, last year we saw that when the student invited both, it was sending them, sometimes it was sending them in a loop or a circle that they could never get out of unless both parents did something that they actually didn't have to do. So it was just creating a technical glitch, and then it was also creating a lot of work that was unnecessary. And then for our students who have parents without social security numbers, they'll be checking this box. When they check this box, it's going to ask them to enter the mailing address, and they're going to want to match that to exactly what the parent put when they created their account. All right, so we're moving on to the demographics section, and this information that's gathered is only used for research purposes, and then it does not impact aid eligibility. So they're very explicit about this on the page. The student also has the option to answer that they prefer not to answer. Then it's going to ask about their citizenship status. And so we're going to talk about this all in much more detail in an upcoming webinar in the first week of December, but just want to briefly go over this because it's always a very hot topic. So our students, their eligibility does depend on their status. So students are eligible for federal aid if they're a US citizen or national, or if they're an eligible non-citizen. So let's go ahead and define those. So, our US citizen, persons who are born in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and in most cases, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And then it's also most persons born abroad to parents who are citizens. And then we have US national, natives of American Samoa or Swains Island. Then we have this category that if a student's not a US citizen or US national, then they might be an eligible non-citizen if they have certain documentation. So the largest category usually is green card, which is a permanent resident. Also, folks who have an arrival departure record, such as which was an I-94, and that's a refugee, asylee, parolee. Then folks with a T visa or a parent with a T1 visa. So these are victims of human trafficking. And then we also have victims of abuse, and then citizens of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or the Republic of Palau. And then lastly, we have those who have status under the J Treaty. So these are Canadian born Native Americans. So all the folks listed in these bullets, these are considered to be eligible non-citizens. So they're not citizens, but they are eligible for federal aid still. And then we want to make a distinction between those folks and then folks who are not eligible for federal student aid. So this includes students who have been granted Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals or DACA, our students who have an F1 or F2 student visa, who have a J1 or J2 exchange visitor visa, those who have a G series visa, or those who have no protected status, so are undocumented students. So these students are not eligible for federal aid. And then I just saw a question pop up in the chat. I'll come back to that right after this section. So just wanted to talk about eligibility briefly, but we are going to discuss that in much more detail in our next webinar. It's December 4th, and it's about navigating financial aid for immigrant families. And again, what we were just talking about in those last few slides was specifically student eligibility. So this is not referring to the parents. This is asking about a student's citizenship status. All right, then the students asked about their high school completion status. So if they have a diploma or a GED, then the student is going to enter their high school. So they're going to do that by either searching the state and city and then getting a bunch of different options within that city. The big part of this screen and what is most helpful for y'all is that students are extra careful they're selecting the correct high school, because that is how you are then able to track the FAFSA completion status for your students. So whatever a student indicates here, their record is then tracked with that high school, and that's the data that we get from federal student aid to be able to populate the AIC portal and then other kinds of trackers. So if you want good data for your high school, make sure your students are correctly inputting their high school here. Then we're going on to the financial section. So the student's going to be asked about whether they filed a tax form. If students aren't filing taxes, but they're not sure if they should be, we've linked a resource here. It's the publication 17. They can check table 1-2 on page 9 to see if they should be filing taxes. Essentially, it's a threshold for the level of earned income and the level of unearned income that they're receiving. But some students do file taxes. Many of them might be filing taxes not necessarily because they have a filing requirement, but because they want to get their withholding back. So there is a difference there. Then the student's going to be asked about their taxes and their income and other financial information. So they'll put the dollar amounts in their responses here. And then they're going to be asked about their assets. So the actual FAFSA gives a little bit of information about what it means with these different kinds of assets. I mean, students primarily, I think, are only going to have cash savings or checking and not necessarily investments. But if they want to see how all of this is being defined, they can look at our guide. Some families don't have to report assets if they meet certain criteria, but whenever the student starts the form, they're always going to be presented with the assets question. And then once their parent contributes to their FAFSA, the FAFSA will determine whether or not they're going to use that asset information. So if a family has income under a certain threshold, then the FAFSA is going to essentially throw out the student's response to the asset questions. The student then indicates the colleges that they want to receive their FAFSA information. So they're going to search by state, city, or school name, and they have to add at least one college to be able to continue. When they're searching for the school, this is one of the glitches with the FAFSA right now. The full name of the school might not be displayed on the screen. So, especially for our schools that have multiple programs or multiple locations, they might not be able to see like which school they need to select. So in that case, they're going to have to look for the school's federal school code. And then they're going to click this option right here on the screen, search by school code, to be able to get the correct location that they want to indicate. And the student can find that federal school code just by doing a simple Google search. Students can send their FAFSA information to up to 20 schools. We always encourage them to send their information to any college they're considering applying to. So it doesn't hurt for their information to be sent to a college that they ultimately end up deciding not to apply to, but you might as well send it even if you're slightly considering a college. It just makes sure that you don't have to go back into your FAFSA and add that school later. Then they're going to get to the review page. So this is going to display the students' responses to all of the questions on the FAFSA, and they can view their responses by either expanding all of these sections or just clicking through each section and expanding that individual section. And then if they need to edit any of their responses, they can actually click on the question, which will take them directly to that page to make an edit. And then since this student is a dependent student, they're going to see that they've invited their parent to their form. So it's telling you right here that the date the parent was added and then that the invite was sent. And then it's showing the status of the parent section. So right now the parent has not yet contributed. Then we get all the way to the signature page. So on this page, the student's going to review the terms and conditions of the FAFSA and then what they're agreeing to if they sign their form. After they agree to those terms, the student can submit the form. So they're signing by checking this box and then clicking sign. And then for a dependent student, the parent info has to be provided for the FAFSA to be considered complete and get processed. So at this point, the student's just doing their portion, and then they're notified that their section is complete. But then we notice that it says you're almost there. So your section's complete, but then your FAFSA form is not complete until your parent fills out their section and signs it. So again, we see the parent listed and we're told that the invite was sent. And then this page is also going to display like those next steps that the student has to take. So that gets all the way through the student portion. Then we're going to talk more about the parent portion. So when a dependent student invites their parent to contribute, the parent is going to get notified of that via email, and then the parent's going to log in with their own FSA ID to complete their section. So here's an example of what the email looks like. Federal Student Aid is prompting the parent to help their student complete the form. So they are given a button to get started. When they click the get started, it will take them over to studentaid.gov. And then if the parent's not already logged in, then they're going to need to log in with their own credentials. Again, parents need their own separate FSA ID to be able to contribute. And so this should be the parent that the student was told by the wizard to invite, and then that the student listed on the parent invitation page. Once the parent logs in, they're going to see their My Activity screen, and they're going to see their invitation from their student to contribute. So they're going to click Accept Invitation. Then they're going to basically answer the same questions that the student was asked, but about themselves. And then there are a few additional questions that parents are asked. They're asked about family size. They're asked about the number of people in the house who are in college. And then they're also asked about annual child support received. But for the most part, they're answering almost the same questions as the student, but they're responding about themselves. So then they get all the way through demographics, financials to the signature page, and they're also acknowledging the terms and conditions, and then they're signing their portion. Now, once the parent is signing, since both the student and the parent have signed, the parent is seeing the option to sign and submit. So the student only saw the option to sign because the FAFSA knew your parent still has to add their information. But in this situation, since the FAFSA knows student and parent have done their job, they're going to see sign and submit. Now we see congratulations, the FAFSA form is complete. So with this, the student is going to receive an email and it's going to have a full detailed confirmation. And now the FAFSA form is considered complete and ready for processing. So it's actually going to be processed and then sent to all of the colleges that the student indicated on their form. And because of that, the form will get processed and the student should receive a FAFSA submission summary. So the FAFSA submission summary is going to give them a lot of good information. It's going to show them, and they do have the option to print this for their records, but it's going to show them their eligibility overview, then all of their answers to the questions, school information, and next steps. And then this is how you print up here in the top right. It's going to say the date that it was processed. And then if there are any corrections that need to be made, it can be made from the submission summary. So on our eligibility overview tab, the student is going to see information about what federal student aid they're going to be eligible for, like the Pell Grant or any kind of loans. And then they're also going to see their student aid index or their SAI. That might not mean much to them. I don't really think it needs to mean much to them. That's really more so for financial aid officers to be able to determine their aid awards. But it's important for the students to know when they're looking at their eligibility overview that these are just estimates and these are not guaranteed. So their actual aid awards are going to come directly from the colleges where the student has applied. So here's what it might look like. This says federal Pell Grant up to $7,395, federal direct loans up to $5,500, federal work study, you may be eligible. So this just gives a student a rough estimate or an idea. So after the students gotten their submission summary, they're ideally hearing back from the colleges where they applied. So they might be receiving aid awards that they can either accept or decline, or they might be notified by the college's financial aid office that they've been selected for verification. And all this means is that a student is being asked to provide additional documentation to verify what they reported on their FAFSA. And it doesn't mean that the student has done anything wrong. It just means that the college has to further verify the information. If there is nothing to verify, then they might start receiving aid offers from the college, and then the student can either accept or decline those. In the case where a student thinks that the aid being offered isn't really meeting their financial need, or the student thinks my financial information that I reported doesn't reflect my current financial situation, say they lost a job or their parents, both parents became unemployed or switched to a lower income job. The student then can share that they have these special circumstances with the financial aid office of each college. So, special circumstances are different from our unusual circumstances. So, we remember our unusual circumstances or situations where a student cannot get into contact with their parent to be able to provide parent information. Our special circumstances are financial in nature, where something has changed since the 2023 tax year, and now those 2023 taxes are not an accurate representation of my ability to pay for college. So this can be changes to or loss of employment, medical bills, or other expenses. And then the financial aid office can use that information to make what's called a professional judgment to then consider what the student might be eligible for. So these are key messages that we always share. The FAFSA is free to complete. It's for all kinds of credentials, so technical and professional certificates, as well as academic degrees. Really important for our students in Alabama, they are likely eligible for Pell Grant aid, and that maximum award is up to $7,395 per year, which for our Alabama students would fully cover tuition and fees at our two-year colleges. Many non-federal grants and scholarships also require FAFSA completion. So it's not just for those federal loans or the federal Pell Grant. It's also required by outside scholarship organizations that use the FAFSA to make determinations. And then we encourage students to be aware when they're applying to many different colleges that each college has their own priority deadline for financial aid applications, or they have no deadline at all. So just be aware of what each school is asking of you and when to get the FAFSA done. And then on top of just the FAFSA, being aware of the college's scholarship deadlines if they have any. For our parents, we want them to know that the FAFSA is safe and secure using studentaid.gov. We'll talk about this more during our webinar in early December, but we have gotten a few questions about our citizen students who have undocumented parents, like messaging towards them. And we were on a federal policy webinar yesterday, and I just kind of wanted to share the language that they had around this topic. So they, of course, understand any hesitance a family in this situation might have. What they shared is that under the upcoming president's previous administration, none of the information shared by undocumented parents was ever shared outside of the context of the Department of Education. So it wasn't shared to in any way impact their status as an immigrant to the United States. All the information they shared was kept within the US Department of Education. So they said that in a hopeful tone, or if that was the situation from 2016 to 2020, hopefully that is also our situation from 2024 to 2028, where Information being shared is solely for the purpose of determining a student's federal aid eligibility and for no other reasons. With that being said, we want families to feel confident in their decision. So as we continue to get federal guidance, we will also share that with you. So again, only determined to use your student's eligibility for financial aid. The student definitely needs the parent to complete the entire application. The parent is a critical component of the FAFSA. And then a thing that we really try to combat is the student who just thinks, oh, my parents make way too much money. I'm not going to qualify for aid. Why would I spend my time doing this? Well, firstly, we don't know what tomorrow or the next year is going to look like. We don't know how our financial circumstances might change. But again, the FAFSA is not only used to determine eligibility for federal aid, but all kinds of aid. So it really does behoove the student to have that FAFSA on file. A few resources. So we have our educator toolkit. A lot of the things that I displayed on the slides are contained within the toolkit, and you can find them linked in the slides when we send our follow-up email. National College Attainment Network, they also have a training toolkit that I would encourage you to look through. We'll make sure to link resources that we highly recommend in our newsletter that are coming from the NCAN training toolkit. And then, not sure how many of you used this last year, but Federal Student Aid was putting out regular issue alerts whenever a technical glitch was happening with the form. Our understanding is that because the 2025-26 FAFSA went through such rigorous testing during the beta testing phase, that there shouldn't be as many issues this year, that a lot of those issues have been rectified. We know some of the issues are still in progress, they're being fixed. But if you're seeing something pretty regularly, if you're seeing a theme as your students are working through the FAFSA, then it might be a known issue. And federal student aid on this webpage kind of tells you what either the workaround is or the timeline for that issue to be resolved. But we'll definitely keep you in the know as it relates to that. And also, if you don't have time to look through all these issue alerts, y'all are very busy people, give us a call on our help desk and we'll do all that work for you. I'll promote our help desk number in a few slides. So, some news as it relates to not our help desk, but Federal Student Aid's hotline. I know a lot of you have experience calling this with your students to try to figure out things that can't be resolved without a Federal Student Aid agent. So, they have greatly expanded their staffing for the hotline. The new hours of operation, I'm a little hesitant to share these because I haven't seen this confirmed on the website yet, but this is what we were told directly by Federal Student Aid. It should be 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time, particularly for FAFSA related questions. We were told that Tuesdays and Wednesdays seem to be the best days to actually get through to an agent with the least amount of hold time. And then we were given a note that around the Thanksgiving holidays, they will be closing at 5 p.m. on Friday, November 29th. And then they will have Saturday hours, but they're pretty limited, so 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then they're always going to be closed on Sunday and federal holidays. So we really encourage you to use this line only as a last resort. Ideally, we can help you through almost any situation, but there are definitely some cases where it requires an agent, and there's nothing we can do on our end. Now, we are also told some promising things about interpretation or translation support. So, as students are either creating their FSA IDs or working on their FAFSA form, they're able to access written content in all the languages that you see here. So, you'll click this link to be able to access that, and then you'll choose among all the different languages. And then in addition to written content, speakers of those languages and 60 other languages can call this specific number and then press 7 to reach an agent. When they do that, they'll say interpreter and then the name of the language that they would like to speak in. So I'm not sure we even knew of this resource last year, but hopefully you're able to get through it rather quickly. I know there was a lot of issues with hold time in the past, but most all of the federal student aid pages are available completely in English and Spanish. For certain written content in other languages, you would go through this support page. All right, so I know we have a few questions in the chat. Do students have to invite the contributor, or can the contributor log in themselves if they have completed their FSA ID already to complete consent and sign? They have to invite the contributor just to be able to link themselves to the contributor. Without that link, there would be no way for the parent to then add their information because they wouldn't yet have a student to add it to. So if the parent already has an FSA ID and they were just to log in, they wouldn't see any invitation to accept without the student sending the invitation. The only thing that the parent could do without the invitation being sent is start the student's FAFSA from their end, which is kind of a totally different process than what we previewed with you today. So the fastest process is for the student to start, invite the parent, and the parent to contribute. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I have a parent who would like to know more about assets and how they're considered. They listed specifically how parent savings versus student savings account will be considered and how 529 savings versus standard savings are considered. Our asset guide should address that specifically. And I know the 529 savings can get a bit confusing, but I know the FAFSA has explicit instructions for how to address that. So if there's anything you have confusion around, feel free to reach out to us about that. Yes, the information about assets is in the asset guide. So when we have our FAFSA checklist, we have some extra links here about assets. And then it's also linked in one of the slides, but I'll make sure it's in the email. And it goes in to a lot of depth about the assets and their definitions. And then anything that I haven't been able to find in that guide, I've just found in the actual PDF of the FAFSA. When you're looking at a PDF version of the FAFSA, almost every question on the FAFSA has notes that are in an appendix, and all of the notes in the appendix go into great detail about what it's looking for. Okay, so Josephine, how fast will a student receive their FAFSA submission summary? And where is this housed on the student gov page? So we were told that for this cycle, it should be the usual processing time that we were used to in previous years. So 3 to 5 days for a student's FAFSA to get processed and for them to receive the FAFSA submission summary. So they should receive email notification that their submission summary is available, but then also when they log in using their FSA ID, they should see that in kind of their landing page. Feel free to keep adding questions to the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and launch our poll questions so that folks who have time restraints can get out on time. So our first set of poll questions should be on your screen now. There should be just 2 questions there. After this set, we're going to have another set of questions following it. So please hang on for that second set. When you are logging into PowerSchool, you'll search for this particular session by going to course number 322173 and section number 517614. We'll have those details included in our follow-up email too. And then as a reminder, when you're getting into PowerSchool to confirm your attendance, try to do that within the next 48 hours, just so that they can get that processed. Okay, I'm closing this poll question now. And then our second set of questions should be on your screen. And there are 4 questions in this set. April, I'm seeing your question. So you have a student whose family has a pending divorce, and the divorce might be final before the school's priority deadline for financial aid. So you're asking, should they wait to complete the FAFSA, just with the understanding that mom has not worked in 10 years, so her financial situation will be drastically different from her marital taxes from the 2023 tax year. So let me think through the benefits of this. If they were to complete the FAFSA now, they would be answering the questions about their parents as if their parents are married, where they would have joint taxes filed. If if the student were answering questions after the divorce were final, would the student be receiving majority support from, I'm assuming, the other parent who's not the mom that hasn't worked in 10 plus years? This is one of the situations where you got to kind of think through all the benefits of the time of completion, because the FAFSA is asking questions as of the day that the student is completing the form. So sometimes it does behoove the student to wait, just kind of depending on their situation. But if after the parents have finalized the divorce and the student would be primarily supported by the parent who hasn't worked in 10 years, that seems a bit odd to me. But it is feasible. Oh, I see. Okay, so it's a situation of like abandonment by the father. It might be worth waiting, but there's also the option to complete the FAFSA now and follow up with a special circumstance with the college's financial aid office. If you'd like to talk about this in more detail, I can follow up with you over email, just in case there's more details that we need to get. Like I've been mentioning, we are going to have our Navigating Financial Aid for Immigrant Families webinar December 4th, right now at 10:30 a.m. You can register on our events page, which you see down here. We're hoping that we have all the information we would like to have by the time of that webinar. Things are a bit in flux as we still await guidance from federal policy analysts who are analyzing the impact of the election results. So we'll do our best to talk about what we do know at that point, but we might also have some updates throughout the remainder of the academic year. Definitely encourage you to reach our help desk, which is 334-316-6155. You can text us or call us there with any of your questions. You can refer your students and families to that number. We're definitely here to help. And if there are long hold times with FSA, we hope that you won't experience anything like that with us. You can also connect with us over email. We're at algoestocollege@alabamapossible.org. We'll definitely keep you in the know with our weekly newsletter. So if you are signed up for our campaign, but you're not receiving our newsletter, definitely reach out to us at this email and we'll make sure to check on what's happening. Sometimes school districts, security systems block our newsletter. So let us know if you haven't been receiving that every Wednesday. It usually goes out Wednesday at 8 a.m. Definitely want to make sure you're getting all the resources. But we appreciate y'all sticking around for an hour and a half, and I'll make sure to have the recording uploaded by Friday at the latest for you to go back and revisit. But you will receive a follow-up email from us today that has all of the resources we discussed. So thanks again, and we're always here to support.